around workforce reporting and how it builds trust through transparency. Delighted to be joined again by my co-lead, Pete Brown, based in London. And Nadia Pickard, making her debut on our LinkedIn Live, is a partner based in Germany who leads our global reporting. So welcome, Pete and Nadia.
Thank you.
So workforce reporting and broader disclosures around ESG metrics. We know that this is a very topical issue. It's very contentious. It has got a lot of press with investors, with workers, with leaders. What we all know is that the world at the leadership level, at the business level, has made big commitments around net zero. We have to do that for our society. But we also know that there's some confusion. There's some anti-sentiment around this topic, and there's a real opportunity now for businesses to take the lead to say, what is our story around our set of measures? How do they relate to the workforce, specifically around the things we want to measure around gender representation and equity and safety, and also what are the reports and the disclosures that are really important to our workforce, like emissions and how we're decarbonizing? So Nadia, you've been working with a lot of clients on this topic. How do you see this issue? What are the big issues that you're focused on right now around this topic?
Yeah, I think the boards are very acutely aware that the reporting landscape is changing. Obviously towards ESG reporting, just as a buzzword, you said that, but really the story behind that is that investors are asking very different questions these days. And in a lot of countries and for a lot of businesses, attracting talent and attracting the right talent becomes much more front of mind. And if you put that all in a bit mix, then it does get a bit complicated, because you mentioned the net zero commitments. Now, investors and the workforce and the communities around the production sides and the companies are asking the question, so how do you really get there, right? So that how do you really get there might involve closing plans or changes in business model. Well, then the next question is, what does that then mean to the workforce, right? How does the company plan to deal with the people that they currently employ? How are they planning to retrain, reskill these people, including people in the communities where they actually source their workers, their workforce? So just to hit on a few to make it really complicated, and that's the problem that actually companies are faced with right now, that this challenge to really address complex issues and not lose your workforce on the way. And then on top, you layer all the things that you said, which is the general expectation of society at large, and consequently also investors that are actually ultimately working with the money that society gives them around equal pay, diversity, equity, inclusion. I think this almost becomes a new baseline. So getting that under control, looked at, reported, and then managed properly is becoming almost a baseline of requirements these days.
Nadia, let me just build on that if I can, right? So you talk very loosely around the landscape of investors, of stakeholders, workforces, and the pressures on boards, right, to report on ESG and show that kind of progress. Yeah, if I cast my mind back, right, so the last PwC CEO survey about 9 months ago, I think we heard a similar sentiment, but I remember quite interestingly, it was when you then correlated to the levels of investment, stated investment within ESG reporting, it was quite modest, to be kind. That was 9 months ago. Have you seen a shift in that? Because I'm just conscious to meet those demands, I would have thought you need some kind of benchmark baseline from which to then show progress.
Yeah. Look, two things to that question. Yes, the landscape is shifting significantly, and that is for two reasons. Number one, there's increased compliance requirements around big pieces of regulation that are on the horizon. For example, the CSRD for Europe, with some extraterritorial impact for companies outside Europe that do business in Europe, which really covers a host of ESG or sustainability, rather sustainability measures that actually need to be reported on, plus the strategy, measurements, targets, risk and opportunities angles of that particular directive. The other driving force is that it becomes really apparent that the expectation towards quality of data and reporting has much increased, and that the old processes of scrambling a few data together to tell a nice story in the glossy part of the annual report, that's really yesterday's expectations. Today's expectations are the data are robust, the disclosures are robust and can really be relied on, which requires a whole different level of systems and processes and controls around gathering the data and making sure that you really are in control of these data.
So I love your point, Nadia, there around churning out data for a glossy and how that's changing. Because I think Bhushan, we saw this in the Hopes and Fears survey. I think at a time when we've got rising employee activism, right, and anyone who thinks the Great Resignation is over, the data is not supporting that at the moment, right? We're still seeing if you've got skills, right, you've got a choice, and I think there's an importance here on boards, leaders being really transparent about the data. Just be clear about what it is. I think workers, employees are expecting that, so maybe that's behind some of the things you're talking about there.
Yeah. So we don't want just a glossy story. We need some good data, but we really need leaders to be aligned on what that story is. And is it a different story to the investors about our ratings? Is it a different story to governments on how they're participating? Is it a different kind of story to suppliers that they've got to kind of provide guidance to, and obviously to their workers? But what we know is this is contentious. We know that this is polarized. Yes, we have employee activism, but we also have a lot of leaders in private saying to us, does this go away? We're heading into a downturn. Investment dollars around this type of topic are going to be more scarce. We've got a terrible issue with a lack of supply given the Ukraine crisis. So how do businesses kind of get their leaders aligned and on the train about this topic, even though we're going to have some of those blips and shocks along the way?
Yeah, look, I sit in Germany. I think everybody who reads the newspapers knows about the gas crisis that we are potentially about to face. I'm not giving up hope that reason will prevail, but that, for example, has severe consequences on businesses that are energy intensive, which then really re-amplifies the need of business to consider their sources of energy, which then puts more pressure in the future on potentially changing the business model or changing something about how you do your business. What I'm saying is, yes, there are short-term crises. Obviously, in a time of really rising inflation, of an energy crisis, of a war lingering at companies' borders, right? The short-term investment will not be into considering the greater good of the world and make sure that the last employees' wishes are really looked at. It has to come together, though, however, because these short-term crises typically really amplify more structural issues. And that's when you build back from that shorter-term crisis, which, for example, with that gas crisis, hopefully is only going to be weeks, maybe months, but certainly not years. The demand of your workforce, of governments, of your investors to understand how you are building back and how you are dealing with that crisis, not only in financial performance measures, but around what are you actually doing, become a lot higher. So that's when we are back at reporting on these matters that are interesting for governments, employees, investors, and everybody in the ecosystem that a company is embedded in.
What are you seeing, Nadia, in terms of, you sort of touched on there in terms of sectors, right? My own experience, but you have way more conversations about this than me, I think. An oil and gas organisation I work with right now, the things they want to report on and that their colleagues want them to report on, a heavy focus around environmental issues, around sustainability, right? I would suggest different emphasis to say, let's take PwC, right? We report, and our colleagues expect us to report much more about workforce, gender, diversity, those kind of things. Is that reflective of what you're seeing, or am I alone?
No, you're not. Look, every industry has more material sustainability issues than the next industry. So it's quite normal for a board in a particular industry to focus first on the things that are really significant and really material. Now, that is a loaded sentence, because what is material is one of the really contentious points on how you measure that and how you think about it. Do you only take the traditional concepts of enterprise value, value to business into account, or do you also look beyond what is material, again, for your stakeholders, including employees, including workforce, including supply chains, customers, and so on, right? But again, it's clear that not all the strategies and not all the issues are the same, and some need to start tackling climate change and energy transition much more urgently than societal workforce, equal pay, equal equality, training, upskilling than others.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you both say is the industry and the business model matters, and certain things are going to be a greater priority in different sectors. The leaders need to be aligned around this story, and it's not just a glossy report, it's about real credible data. Before we talk about kind of the workers and the implications on the workers, when we talk about the type of data, what's really interesting is in our Hopes and Fears survey, Pete, as you mentioned, the biggest desire right now for the worker is reporting around physical and safety. So kind of mental health and safety record. And second, I remember, was around job creation and paying our fair share of taxes. And climate was lower and the DEI piece was lower. So I think it's really important that we understand that there's certain time horizons that the workers will desire much more transparency, and we need to make sure that that data is authentic and quality and attested, especially for kind of large organizations, because that credibility, if we are just greenwashing or just telling a glossy story, we ruin the credibility around all this topic. I'm curious your thoughts there.
Well, I was just going to add, actually, I've just covered the screen, but there's a brilliant question just coming about that, Bhushan, right? So, basically saying, are we going to move from a theoretical discussion to a more pragmatic one? Workers aren't afraid to speak up, right? Now that's totally reflected in the Hopes and Fears survey, right? Where what we heard from the 52,500 workers was, the levels of investment by organisations to help people understand how to decarbonise their jobs was low. But also the point there around theoretical, right? Many of the workers said, look, they're really up for this journey. They want to be part of it. They want to contribute to it. But two things: one, they can spot a mile off when their organisations are saying one thing and doing something differently. And the second thing they say is, often the language the descriptors use are so theoretical and sort of academic, they find it really hard to relate to. Nadia, build a lot there, right? It'd be great to get your reflections on that.
Look, and also one of the questions that showed up on the screen. Let me give you one response out of the current drafts of the disclosure requirements under CSRD. In the S1 disclosure requirements, the first standard under the social pillar of the EFRAG standards, there will be required disclosures around strategy and plans and selected KPIs around discrimination incidents related to equal opportunity, around employment of persons with disability, about how a company deals with grievances and complaints related to other work-related rights. So just to assure some listeners that it's not only the macro level, it's not only nice talk. People are really being, companies are really being held accountable towards how they deal with topics and issues like that. And just the mere fact that you have to think about what you disclose around your processes and systems and your culture around these topics and underpin it with KPIs, in my mind, will drive behavioral change. And I get back to Peter's point, you can't just make it up. The data need to be assured, the data need to be trustworthy, and the data need to be consistent over time, right?
So whilst you're on a roll, Nigel, there are questions coming specifically for you, right, in terms of your appetite, your reporting space. Are you seeing organisations, A, taking an interest, and B, want to be benchmarked against their peers in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, every client conversation I have is around, so what do others do, right? That question is twofold. That question is around, how do others deal with the challenges that we now have to solve? But that's also around, give me benchmarking data. How do others in the industry compare to what I'm doing? And that's, again, why some of the disclosures that everybody hates, because it's so prescriptive and it's so detailed and so cumbersome to actually put it together. But some of these disclosures actually provide for like ratios and relations that make the data and the outcomes of these disclosures really comparable, not only across peers, but also across the board, right? So short response, yes.
So let's talk about, you mentioned education. So let's talk about education, because we can get the leaders aligned, we can have good scenario plans, we can have kind of different conversations by stakeholder group, but there's a whole section of workers, for them it is theoretical, as the person mentioned. So, educating them on emissions and the different types of emissions that you have and what their role is in their working life to kind of manage those through their daily behaviors, whether it's travel, whether it's data center technology usage, whether it's kind of investment decisions they make, through to, as you're changing your business model and you're trying to decarbonize different parts of your value chain or your ecosystem. So it feels like we're at the first innings in terms of education around that topic. What do we need to do there? And we're doing that in a polarized environment where many people actually bury their head in the sand and think this is a very politicized issue, especially in the US.
Yeah. Look, I think part of the story is, obviously, there is a true investor demand, because, again, it may sound big and theoretical, but what I'm really truly believing in is investors ultimately handle the money of you and I, right? There might be this anonymous crowd of big business that is detached from our daily life, but it's not, because ultimately they handle my money, they handle your money, they handle the pension money of a lot of people. And these investors are hearing the desire of their customers, which again is you and I, to really tackle those issues. So there might be individuals that don't really believe in it, but everything around the whole ecosystem and the demands that are being driven, whether that is governments in Europe that are elected by people that give them a clear agenda to be dealing with, which is, again, the people telling the government what to do around these topics, or whether that is through an investor lens that actually administers money they get from people, from pension funds and all, and so on. It has to be done. So I can't beat around the bushes. There might be skeptics. There will be a lot of skeptics, but everything points to it has to be done, right? So let's start with that. Now, how it's actually translated into a company, into different levels of a target operating model, of training, of gamification, of linking perks or benefits to certain changes in behavior over time, measured, discussed with the workforce. That is a very loaded question that we can spend probably 2 more sessions like this on, right? But yeah.
I'm just building on that a bit. There's an interesting question that's come there from Davey around reporting on the stuff that exists today, but then that analysis going forward around that connection between what you're measuring and business performance. Now, I think feeding you here, but the business performance to me is actually not just, as we said, around the financial returns. It's around the impact on society, the impact on the climate, all the things we've talked about. But again, maybe Bhushan, this is one that might be one for you to sort of just tie the ends on, and just conscious of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, so as we look to connect those dots, I mean, again, we've talked about leaders, we've talked about the story, we've talked about the scenario plans, the role of workers in kind of getting upskilled in this area, and engaging with the naysayers, like engaging in a constructive debate around what concerns people. Is it because this is theoretical? Is it because we're conflating all of the emissions data with the human capital data, and that doesn't make sense to your business? And again, businesses need to make those decisions. I think the role of government and policymakers is incredibly critical in driving this forward. We've seen this before with other topics in the workplace, whether it's digitization and upskilling, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion. We've got to have a long-term commitment around this topic. So it's incumbent on kind of every business leader there. I just kind of, one piece of advice from both of you to your relevant stakeholders as they think about this topic. Starting with you, Nadia.
Two things that just crossed my mind while you were talking, Bhushan. Number one, boards need to listen not only to investors, but other stakeholders, and they need to listen carefully to the workforce. The workforce, especially those who are very skeptical about the change that is coming, and that people proclaim, be vocal about it. Try to ask yourself, why are you so skeptical? And is that because something is threatening to you? And that is something that you can voice and people can then deal with.
And Pete?
Yeah, from me, I think it's around transparency, right? Workers expect organisations to be transparent about this data, and actually, not only transparent, but about the data, but where they're going to take it, how are they going to improve that data? Because I think you may have another organisation may have worse sort of benchmark starting data than you, but if you're not doing anything about it, then don't be surprised if talented people with scarce skills decide to go and opt to work for an organisation that is doing something about it.
Wonderful. And I'll just add to that, engage your leaders in the debate, and it's okay if they disagree, as long as every business, again, based on regulatory drivers and investor demands, kind of has a clear path and a deliberate plan that, again, it can be agile in response to changes. So thank you so much, Pete and Nadia. We're taking a break for August for vacations, etc. But we'll be back on September the 9th with Joe Salter to talk about transformative leadership. You won't want to miss that, because Joe Salter is used to hanging out with Tom Cruise, and now she's going to hang out with Pete and I. Joe was the first female pilot, and she's going to have some great stories around leadership. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of the summer. We'll see you in September.
Thank you.
Thank you.